What's going on, everyone? My name is Hunter and welcome to a brand new SvelteKit video. In today's video, we're going to learn how to set up authentication using PocketBase and SvelteKit. Now, if enough people are interested, I will start a mini series on PocketBase and SvelteKit where we'll continue to build off of the work we do today, and we'll try to cover as much as possible while building a small application. So if that's something that you would be interested in, please leave a comment down below letting me know. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, PocketBase is an open source backend in one file. And if we look at their documentation here, we can see that it contains an embedded database using SQLite with real-time subscriptions, built-in users management, a convenient dashboard UI, and simple REST-ish API. And it also says that the easiest way to get started is to download the pre-built minimal PocketBase app, which we're going to download the Linux version because I'm running on WSL. And before we do that, though, we actually want to read down here and we can see that PocketBase will automatically create a new directory alongside the executable to store your application data and settings. So with that in mind, we're going to want to create a new directory before we actually go and download and extract this executable so that the data is kept with the project that it belongs to. So we'll right click this Linux link here and copy it. And then I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to make a new directory called SvelteKit PocketBase Auth. And then I'm going to navigate to that directory. And then I'm simply going to type curl-l-o. And then I'm going to name this file pb for PocketBase, and then I'm just going to extract or download that zip file here. And now, since this is a zip file, we actually need to extract it. So I'm just going to say unzip pb. And then you're going to see if we run an ls here, we can see that we just have the zip file still. We have a license for PocketBase, and then we have the PocketBase executable. So what we want to do first is I'm just going to remove that zip file because we don't need it anymore. Whoops. And now we have PocketBase and license inside of our directory here. So what we can do is we can now just run that /PocketBase serve. And you can see that we now have a server started at 127.0.0.1.80.90, which is localhost 8090. And we also have the REST API running as well as the admin UI. So we can click on the admin UI here and actually navigate to the admin UI and check it out for a second. So it's going to first prompt you to create your first admin user in order to continue. So I'm just going to do that now. Now, once you do that and create your account, you're going to be brought to the collections page, which is currently empty. And collections are essentially tables in our database. So we don't need to create any collections at the moment. So let's move on to the users page. And this is where our users collection lives. So as you can see at the top, we have different fields that come by default, which include ID, email, profile.name, profile.avatar, created and updated. So if you notice these two fields here, profile.name and profile.avatar have profile in front of them when the others do not. And if we look at the PocketBase documentation and we click on manage users, we can see that by default, all user models have the following properties, which is kind of what we just went over here, except we didn't see the verified and last reset, all the verification fields. But it says that in addition to above properties, PocketBase allows you to add as many custom fields as you want using the system profiles collection. The user fields will be appended to each user model under a new profile property. And then it says that the only difference between the profiles collection and a regular one is that it cannot be deleted or renamed. So if we look here in our admin dashboard and we click on this cogwheel, we can see that we have name and avatar here, and you can see that the collection name is profiles, right? So this is a system collection. Now, I do want to make a note here that if you're watching this video potentially weeks or months from the time it was released, I would definitely check out this issue here that was opened. It's a discussion about merging users and profiles that the maintainer has opened up for feedback. So there's been some back and forth going on, but they haven't actually came to a resolution as to whether they're actually going to do it or not. And you'll see why maybe they should do it here in a minute when we actually set up our accounts, because there is an extra step that is required whenever you go to create a user. But definitely go and check out this. I'll have this linked in the description below to make sure that nothing changed. If so, I'm sure they're going to have a migration guide that should make it easy to kind of still follow along with the rest of the video. So now that we have our PocketBase server running, let's go ahead and get started with the SvelteKit integration. And I've went ahead and prepared a starting point for us, which I've styled using Daisy UI and Tailwind CSS. It just includes a simple home page, a login page, and a register page. And to get to this point, all you really need to do is to clone the repository that I have linked in the video description. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new terminal window and I'm going to show you how to do this. And we're going to repos, I think it's SvelteKit PocketBase Auth. And then inside of this directory, we're actually going to run git clone. We're going to do single branch. And then the branch is going to be starter. And then it's going to be git at github.com/huntabyte/SvelteKit PocketBase Auth.git. All right, so Now when we look, we have this directory here. Again, it's just the starter branch of the final code repository. So if you want to start where I'm at right now, feel free to do so and follow along. So we're going to navigate into that directory now, and we're going to need to install all of the packages. Again, really the only packages that I've already installed is Tailwind CSS and Daisy UI. So everything else is pretty standard skeleton SvelteKit project, right? So now that's all installed. We're just going to open it up in our favorite editor, which is VS Code. And as you can see, we just have a few routes here. We have a couple page.sveltes. We have a login page.server, which is empty. And then a layout, which just includes one of the Daisy UI nav bars and a homepage. And then for the login page, again, I'm just using Daisy UI components. There's a couple inputs for the login, which is email and register, or email and password. And then for register, we're taking in a name, email, password, and confirm password. So let's go ahead and run this and just see what it looks like. So if we navigate to localhost 5173, you'll see that we just have a very standard, simple homepage here. We also have a login page and a register page. Now, none of the backend functionality has been implemented yet. I just wanted to go ahead and get some of the initial styling done and structure done because that's not really the focus of the video, which is authenticating with PocketBase. So we're still going to implement all of the backend code together. I just wanted to get this set up in advance. So now if we go back to the PocketBase documentation, we're going to look for their JavaScript SDK. And if we look here on the sidebar, it's going to say client-side integration. We have some SDKs, and it says that the easiest way to integrate is to use one of the official SDK clients. Our JavaScript SDK supports browser and Node, which is what we're going to be using. So let's go ahead and click on that. And it's going to take us to the repository. And I think I can zoom in further here and get the full README. So we can see that we install it via npm using npm install PocketBase-save. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let me open up a new terminal here and install PocketBase. Okay, so now that we have PocketBase installed, let's look a bit further into this documentation and kind of see exactly what we're working with. So if we scroll down a bit, we're going to see a usage example here where they show us creating a new client, which instantiates a new PocketBase instance. But that's not how we're going to do it because we're using server-side rendering, right? So we'll get to that here in a second. But if we keep scrolling down, we can learn a little bit more about authentication with PocketBase. So we can see here that the SDK, similar to Supabase or Firebase, it keeps track of the authenticated token and auth model for you via the client.authstore instance. And then it shows an example of this base auth store, which client.authstore extends, right? So you can see here that we have token, which is the authenticated token. We have model, which is the actual user or admin, whoever's logged in with that auth store. And then we have is valid, which essentially will return true or false, whether the person is actually using a real and non-expired token. Then we have a few different methods here, one of which is clear that we're going to be using to log out the user or admin. We're going to have save here, which we're not actually going to use because of the fact that we're going to implement it a different way. We also have on change, which allows us to register a callback that is fired on the store change. We also have two methods here that we're definitely going to take advantage of. And I believe when I was reading through all the issues and discussions, these were built specifically to help with server-side rendering to kind of make the process a bit easier. So the load from cookie method takes in a cookie header, and then it takes in a key, which defaults to PB auth, which is the default key that cookie is passed to the client with. And then we have an export to cookie, which we can create a cookie from that auth store data. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this here in just a second when we get down to the implementation. So let's scroll down a bit further. And we can see here that it talks about the SSR integration. So of course, there's no one size fits all because every framework handles it differently. But in general, the idea is to use a cookie-based flow. So we create a new PocketBase instance for each server-side request. So if we look up here at the usage example, they created a single client and they kind of used it throughout the application, right? But for us, we're going to be creating a new one on every single request. And we're going to implement that using hooks. And if we scroll down a bit further, you can see that they actually have a SvelteKit example where we actually implement it inside of the hook handle function. The handle function, for those of you who do not understand what the handle function is, I know I haven't made a video on that yet, but essentially it runs on every single request to the SvelteKit server. So even on server-side requests. So what happens is it essentially intercepts that request. So it's like you're able to add essentially middleware to your SvelteKit application. That's essentially what this is. So it takes in an event, which is the request event. And then it also takes in a function called resolve, which will render the route and generate a response. So the first thing we're doing is we're accessing the locals of that request, right? And we're setting event.locals.pocketbase to a new PocketBase instance, which we'll then have access to inside of our load functions, inside the rest of our server-side application, right? And then we're going to load the store data from the request cookie string. So basically, if there is a cookie, we're going to grab it and we're going to pass it into this load from cookie function, which if you recall up here, this updates the store with the parse data from the cookie string. So essentially it's going to rip the cookie out of there. It's going to check for this pb_auth equals key. And then if it exists, it's going to then update the auth store with the data from that cookie. So if I'm logged in, that auth store is now going to have myself as the model. If someone else is logged in, it's now going to have them as the model. And then if there's nothing here, obviously it's not going to have, the is valid is going to be false. There's not going to be anything in the auth store. It's going to essentially be a bunch of empty strings, right? So then we're going to generate a response, which then all the server-side actions that we have set up are going to happen, right, as it resolves this event. And then before we return that response back to the client, we're actually going to update the headers. So we're going to set some headers. We're going to add the set cookie header, and we're going to run this export to cookie method, which if we see here, exports the store data as a cookie with the option to extend the default cookie options, essentially, right? So anything that happens behind the scenes, so if we add something, we edit a user's profile while the server-side actions are happening, we're going to have that latest data now back in our cookie so that the next request has that latest data, right? And then we will return that response back to the client. So let's go ahead and get to implementing this. And I think it's going to be best if we start off by implementing the handle function inside of our hook, as in order for us to even access that PocketBase instance, we need to have that set up. So let's go ahead and inside of our source folder, not the routes folder, we're going to create a hooks.server.js. And then since we have PocketBase installed, we're going to import PocketBase with a capital B from PocketBase. And then we're going to export the handle function. It's going to be asynchronous. And it's going to take an event and resolve, just as we previously discussed. And what we're going to do here is we're actually going to set event.locals.pb equals new PocketBase. And we'll say localhost 8090, as that's where our PocketBase instance is running right now, right? And we'll say event.locals.pb.authstore.load from cookie. So we're taking in a cookie from the request headers like we had just talked about. Or nothing. And then what I like to do here is, this is a personal preference, of course, but I don't like typing out event.locals.pb.authstore.model just to access the currently logged in user's information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an if statement here. So if event.locals.pb.authstore.isValid, I also shortcutted PocketBase as well. You can see that I just used pb here instead of the full PocketBase word. You could also use client. It doesn't really matter. We're going to set the event.locals.user equal to event.locals.pb.authstore.model. Man, that's a mouthful. All right, so now we're going to generate the response. And then we're going to set those headers. And I'm actually going to add a to-do here to remind myself to secure this cookie before deploying. Because we're going to set it on secure cookie because our server is not running on HTTPS. So let's just say response.headers.set, and we'll say set cookie to event locals pb auth store export to cookie. Remember that method we talked about. And then I'm just going to set some cookie options here. We can see here that these are the options we have available to us. I'm just going to say secure is false for now. And then I'm going to return that response. All right, so now that our hook is in place, we actually need to learn how to create a user, right? Because we have a register form here. We don't have any actions set up for it yet or anything like that. So let's go into our documentation here and let's look for the web API users. And if we scroll down here a bit, we'll see they have a create user option here. And they show an example using the SDK. So we can just await client.users.create. And then we can update the profile, which we're going to do it a little bit differently than this. And then we're going to send the verification email, which we're not going to do in this video either, but we may do so at a later time if that's something you guys would like to see. So that being said, let's go ahead and look at our register form page.svelte here. You can see that I already have, I believe, an action set up for register, right? So we know that we're going to need to hit the register action in our page.server.js under the actions. So if you're not familiar with how form actions work in SvelteKit, I have a video related to that. Please go check it out. It'll definitely bring you up to speed on how this works, but we're going to export const actions and it's an object, and we're going to set register. It's going to be asynchronous, and it's actually going to take in locals, right? As well as request. Now, if you recall, we have the PB instance stored in our locals. So that's how we're actually able to call these client .users.create, or in our case, it's going to be pb.users.create inside of this action because we're receiving it from the request through the locals, right? So now what we can do is we can actually access the form data. So we'll say const form data equals await request dot form data. And then we'll say const data equals object dot from entries. And then we'll just pass in form data like this, which will give us an object of the form data. And let's just test this out real quick to see what we're getting back. We'll go to our register form here, and we'll go back to our console that's running the application. And you can see here, this is what we get back inside of that, a nice structured object, right? So now we actually need to run this await client.users.create, right? So we're going to use some try-catch blocks because all of these PocketBase services use standard promise-based responses. So we're going to have to catch the errors like that and then log them. Otherwise, our application will break if it experiences an error. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up a try block here, and we're going to say const new user equals await locals.pb.users.create, and then we're going to pass data into it, right? Now, it doesn't matter, since if you check here on the right, you can see that we should only be passing in the email, password, and password confirm. But if you look at our name here is listed as an object property, right? We can just pass that over there and they will strip it out without us having to do anything, right? But it will not update the name for that user just yet, all right? So then what we're going to do is we're going to take out token and user from that created user. So we'll say await locals.pb.users.auth via email. And what we're doing right now is we're essentially signing in as that user that just registered, right? And we have to do this in order to update the profile name. And that's one of the reasons that the maintainers are discussing potentially merging these two together so that you don't have to do this process. But that's what we're doing. So we're going to say data.email, which is the email. And then we're going to say data.password, which is the password, right? And then now we have that user. What we can do is we can say const updated profile equals await locals.pb.records.update. And we want to update the profiles collection, right? So this is the standard way to update collections, or to create or update or read collections in PocketBase, is we do pb.records.create update list. So we're going to say update, and this is the collection that we want to update. We want to update the profiles, and then we want to update it where the user.profile.id, which is this user here, their profile ID, and then we're going to pass in the object. So it's going to be name is going to be data.name. And now we're going to sign out the user because we either want them to potentially verify their email before they can sign in, or we just want them to re-sign in to make sure they remember their credentials. We can say locals.pb.authstore.clear. And then if we catch an error, we're going to console log the error to our console here, and we'll return error is true with the message of error. And we can use that later with our forms for validation or for displaying an error message or whatever, right? And then if it's successful, so if everything goes well, we want to throw a redirect, which comes from SvelteJS/kit. And we're going to go to 303 and we're going to go to /login. So essentially they registered for an account. Now we want them to go log in on the login page. All right, so now let's just see what happened here. So let's go ahead and log in, and we'll check our PocketBase instance as well once we create this account. So let's just create an account. We'll call this Walt White. You guys know I like my Breaking Bad references. And password, registered. Okay, we got redirected. That means we did not have any errors within that try catch block. So let's go into our PocketBase admin UI here, and let's refresh the users. And as you can see, we do in fact get this user created. So it has an ID and the name was passed as well, right? Which is awesome. So now that we have this user, what we can do is we can actually go and set up the login route to allow them to log in. So let's go into our login page here, page.server.js, and we'll also export const actions, and we'll say login, takes in request and locals. And then we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to take in the form data, request.form data, and then data. All right, now we're going to run a try catch block again. And if you noticed, we actually already ran the auth via email method here. We're going to run that again over here. So we'll extract the token and the users. Let's just set up a try catch block first. And the reason I added these is because you get these back when you log in that user. So you can pull out the user or the token and do whatever you want with it when they log in. I'm not really sure what the use case would be, but it's there if you need it. And then we'll catch any errors. We'll do the same thing. We'll console log the error. And then we'll return error is true and email is data.email. And again, we're passing these values back to the form so that we can access them using that form prop with our form actions. So again, if you're not familiar with that, I have a video related to that. Please go check it out so you're not confused. Okay. And then if it's successful, we want to throw a redirect to the home page, right? They now have access to the home page. And I just got an error here. It's because I didn't actually import the right redirect. So let's just take that out here. And then now we're good to go. Okay. So now let's go ahead and log this user in. So let's go over to our sign in page here and we'll use the account that we just created, walletexample.com and password. And we hit enter and now we are at the home page, right? But that doesn't really give us too much information. So what we can actually do is access some of that user's data inside of our application somewhere else so that we can actually see that we are in fact getting that user's information and that they are in fact logged in. So what we can do here for this example, we may change this later, but we're going to create a new file in our routes directory and we're going to call it plus layout.server.js. And then here we're actually going to export a load function. So export console load. It is going to take in locals. And if you recall, we actually set locals.user to the auth store model. So we can check here and we can say if locals.user and locals.user.profile. So if that user does in fact have a profile, we can return some information about that user. And let me just demonstrate what would happen if, for example, I just returned, let's just say a prop of user, and I returned it as locals.user, right? And I hit save. You're going to see that we actually get an error. It says cannot stringify arbitrary non-POJOs, which stands for plain old JavaScript object. And a plain old JavaScript object is essentially just contains data. It doesn't actually contain any methods or internal state. And if we want to see what this locals.user looks like, we can console log that here. So it's console log locals.user, and I'll omit this return statement here. And let's just save the page. And if I refresh it, and as you can see, this is what we get. This is not a POJO or a plain old JavaScript object. We have some ends here. So how do we convert that into a POJO? Now, one of the easiest ways is to just simply say, let's just say console.log. We can say JSON.parse, right? Now we can't parse this right away. We actually have to stringify it first, and then we're going to parse that stringified non-POJO essentially, right? So we can say JSON.stringify, and then we can just say locals.user. And now let's just see what this looks like. So as you can see, now this is actually a POJO. So we can return this back as the user's profile. And now this will work fine if we're not using TypeScript, but if you want to try to preserve those types, because everything we get back from our PocketBase is going to essentially look like that. We're going to have to kind of parse and then stringify it. So what I would recommend doing is to give yourself a little bit more control over the object, what kind of response type it returns. Let's create a new method inside of lib called helpers.js, and we'll just export a new function called serialize non-POJOs. And it's going to take in an object, which is going to be that non-POJ object. And then we're going to return JSON.parse, JSON.stringify the object, right? And this is where you could specify some return types and do a little bit more manipulation with those different objects that you expect to be receiving back from PocketBase. So now we can go back into our layout.server and we'll use that function we just created instead. So I'm going to import serialize non-POJOs from lib/helpers. And then instead of running this console log here, we're going to replace this with the return statement. And we're going to say return profile is going to be serialized non-POJOs. And we're going to say locals.user.profile. And then since we added this to the layout, we're going to have access to profile inside of every page in our SvelteKit application. So let's go into, for example, the home page here. Let's go here. And what we can do is we can actually update this page.svelte route. So we can just say, accept the data prop first. And then we'll say, welcome to the SvelteKit and PocketBase project. We'll put a comma. We'll say data.profile.name. And then now you can see it says, welcome to the SvelteKit and PocketBase project, Walt White. So now that we have access to that, we can also adjust our layout here so that it doesn't show login and register when the user's already logged in, right? We probably want that to say log out or have a profile picture or something of that sort up there. So let's just change this to a logout button, and that'll be a good time for us to implement our logout functionality, right? So we can add that to our layout.svelte file. So let's go over there because we now have access to that data prop. So we can actually accept data here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set up an if block where if there is a user.profile, then we want to show the logout button. And if not, we want to show the login and register. Now you can see here we have login and register twice. One of them is the mobile menu that Daisy UI's navbar provides us with. If we make this smaller, we can see that we have login and register here as well. So we can update that too. But first, let's start out with the buttons at the top. So let's set up an if block here. So we'll say if, we'll say data.profile. So if a user does exist, if there is a data.profile, we want to show a logout button. And then everything else, we want to show these two buttons, right? So then in that if statement, and we're going to add a form here, right? Because we're actually going to be posting to our own server. So we'll say form, and the action is going to be a /logout. The method is going to be post. And then we'll add a button inside of this form. And we'll add a button btn-primary, and we'll say logout. So now as soon as we hit save, you're going to see that we now have a logout button in the top. We no longer have the login and register buttons, right? So then we can come up here and essentially copy this here. And we'll come up to our mobile menu and we will add this if statement. And then inside of this, we're actually going to wrap this in an li, and we'll bring that down, and then we'll end the if statement right beneath the last li. Okay. And then instead of styling this button like this, we'll just remove the class altogether. And then we can take a look at what this looks like. So if I drag this back, all right, we can see that a button is still there. So now let's go ahead and implement this. And we're going to use an endpoint to take care of this for us. So we're going to come into our routes and we're going to create a new file. We're going to do a logout and then plus server.js, right? Because if you remember from the documentation, in order to actually log a user out, if we look here, within our auth store, we have this clear method, which logs out the authenticated user or admin. So we're just going to make a post request to this endpoint. It doesn't matter who is logged in. It's just going to clear out the auth store, clear out the user that we have currently set in the locals, and then redirect them to log back in. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we'll say export const post equals, we'll say locals. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say locals.pb.authstore.clear, locals.user, because we set this ourselves. If you recall, inside of our hooks, we set locals.user. We're going to clear that as well. We're going to set that to undefined. And then we're going to throw a redirect to the login page. So now let's go ahead and test this out and see if it works. So if we click log out, actually, before I click that, let's just look here at our application within our developer tools. And we can see here that we have this PB auth cookie, right? So I want you to know this is what is being pulled in by our hooks on every single request to see who we are and set the correct auth store data for our subsequent actions, right? And then we update that after those actions occur, we then update that with the latest cookie. So in our case, in this case, it's going to take in Walt White's cookie, and then we're going to log him out, which means it's going to return nothing essentially as the cookie for that auth store. So we're not going to have a cookie at all anymore. And then the user will have to log back in order to actually regain that cookie. So we can click on log out, and you can see that the cookie was cleared, right? Now, if we go to the home page, let's refresh the page here. You can see that we get an error. That's probably because I didn't actually check to see if this exists. So we'll say data.profile.name, and then we'll say else, let's put this here. So now it's just going to put nothing if nobody's there. So now we have no cookie and the user's not logged in. Now let's just say that if a logged in user tries to go to login or register. So let's go to login. Let's log back in. Now I can still access login just fine, even though I'm already a logged in user, right? So let's talk a little bit about trying to protect some of these routes. And this could be implemented on any page or at the layout level, however you would like. And again, if we do decide to move forward with this mini series, then I'll add some of that into the application as well. But for now, let's just protect the sign in and register routes from our authenticated users. So inside of our routes, the register and login, we'll start off with the login. We'll come into our page.server.js and we'll export a load function. We'll take in locals. And essentially what we're going to check is we're going to say if locals.pb.authstore.is valid, right? Because if you recall, that returns a Boolean that's either true or false, true if they are authenticated, false if they're not authenticated. So if it is valid, what we want to do is we want to throw a redirect back to the home page, right? So now you can see that we instantly got redirected, right? Because I saved the page. But if I try to navigate now to login, you'll see that we cannot even get there. It redirects us. Now, if we can do the same thing here on the register route as well. So if we go to register, you can see that we are doing the same thing here. We cannot access the register page. So you can do this again at the layout level or at the page.server.js level, depending on how you want to structure your application. So I think that's going to conclude the authentication with PocketBase and SvelteKit video. We've learned how to not only register users, but also how to log them in. We've also learned how to update the profile at the same time of registration. We've learned how to set up our hooks to actually get that cookie out and return that cookie back to the user after the actions have been taken place. And we've also manipulated some of the UI with the conditions of whether the user is logged in or not. If you guys would like to see me continue this project and add some CRUD operations or whatever you guys would like to see, please let me know in the comments below. And if you have any questions, you can also ask them in the comments below or join the Discord server. We've been gaining members every single day and people are always willing to lend a hand and help out others. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you got some value out of this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.